perhaps the most famous collection of ruins in the entire world. Believed to be constructed during ancient Egypt's 4th dynasty, around 2550 BC. These limestone monuments,
The key that unlocked ancient Egypt. The Rosetta Stone.
This was the earliest mention of the name Israel outside of the Bible.
Over 3,000 years ago, a pharaoh carved a boast into stone, a monument to his victories, a claim to eternal power.
Suitably, it's one of the greatest monuments in ancient Egypt because it's dedicated to one of the greatest pharaohs.
But buried inside his inscription was something he never intended. A word that would ignite debates for millennia. That word? Israel. Not a Hebrew monument, not a religious artifact, just a pagan king, worshiping gods with animal heads, bragging about conquests. Yet somehow, in his arrogance, he preserved a truth no one asked him to. How did a single word, carved by an enemy, become one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in history? What does it reveal about the ancient world, the origins of a people, and the foundations of civilizations still fighting today?
Ancient Egypt was the most important civilization in the world.
Today, we travel back to Egypt, to the granite slab known as the Merneptah Stele, where history hides in plain sight. And what it tells us may change everything you think you know about the ancient world. Egypt at the height of power. To understand why this stone matters, you first have to understand the world that created it. Ancient Egypt in the 13th century before the Common Era was not just a civilization, it was the civilization, the superpower of the ancient world.
The ancient Egyptian civilization lasted for over 3,000 years and became one of the most powerful and iconic civilizations in history.
While other peoples were still organizing into tribal confederations, Egypt had already built monuments that would stand for thousands of years. The pyramids were already ancient history by this point, landmarks from a golden age that Egyptians looked back on with reverence. The pharaohs of this era ruled with absolute authority. They commanded armies that marched across continents. They controlled trade routes that connected Africa to Asia to the Mediterranean world. Their influence stretched across lands we now call Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. When Egypt moved, the ancient world trembled. Merneptah was the son of Ramesses II, one of the most famous pharaohs in all of Egyptian history.
Ramses the Great ruled in the 13th century BC, and by this point the Egyptians had been cutting stone for 1,500 years.
Ramesses had ruled for an astonishing 66 years, longer than most people in the ancient world lived. He had built temples, waged wars, fathered over 100 children, and established Egypt as the dominant force in the region. By the time Merneptah finally inherited the throne, he was already an old man himself, perhaps in his 60s. He had spent his entire life waiting for his moment, and when it finally came, he was determined to prove that Egypt's power had not diminished under his rule. Egyptian pharaohs did not write history the way modern historians do. They did not carefully weigh evidence or acknowledge complexity or admit uncertainty. They carved propaganda into stone. They recorded victories, never defeats. They exaggerated their accomplishments and credited themselves with achievements that sometimes belonged to their predecessors. They named the cities they crushed, listed the peoples they defeated, and proclaimed that the gods themselves had chosen them to rule. This was not deception in the way we might understand it. This was how royal power was, communicated and maintained. The stone monuments were not meant to be accurate historical records. They were meant to be impressive. They were meant to intimidate. They were meant to establish the pharaoh's legitimacy in the eyes of his people and in the eternal judgment of the gods. Merneptah followed this tradition faithfully. Near the end of his reign, after conducting military campaigns to defend Egypt's borders and reassert control over territories that had grown restless, he ordered a massive stone slab to be carved. A stele, as such monuments are called, a vertical stone surface covered with inscriptions meant to commemorate important events and preserve them for eternity.
Stele is a hieroglyphic inscription that describes a military campaign that occurred during the first years of Merneptah's reign in 1210 BC.
The discovery of the Merneptah Stele. The Merneptah Stele was carved around 1208 BCE and erected in the Pharaoh's mortuary temple at Thebes. It stands approximately 10.5 feet tall, an imposing slab of black granite covered on both sides with hieroglyphic text. The craftsmanship is exceptional, the inscriptions deeply carved and well preserved despite more than 3 millennia of existence. For centuries, the stele lay buried and forgotten, lost beneath the sands of Egypt like so many other artifacts from the ancient world. Then, in 1896, the renowned British archaeologist Flinders Petrie discovered it during excavations at Thebes. Petrie immediately recognized the significance of what he had found. The text was long and detailed, covering multiple military campaigns and diplomatic achievements. Most of the inscription discusses Merneptah's wars against the Libyans and their allies, peoples who had threatened Egypt's western border. The language is typical of Egyptian royal propaganda, boastful and dramatic, full of claims about divine favor and military supremacy. The pharaoh presents himself as the chosen instrument of the gods, a warrior king who has crushed all who dared oppose him. For most readers, the text would be interesting but not exceptional. Another pharaoh, celebrating another victory in language similar to dozens of other ancient Egyptian monuments. But near the very end of the inscription, almost as an afterthought, something unexpected appears. A short section, just a few lines among hundreds, easy to miss if you are not paying careful attention. This section describes a separate campaign, apparently conducted in Canaan, the land that would later become Israel.
The most famous name found in this entire inscription, which is right down here, the name Israel.
And within those few lines, carved into granite more than 3,200 years ago, appears a word that would shake the foundations of ancient history. The moment the stone speaks. The relevant passage reads, in translation, as follows: Canaan is captive with all woe. Ashkelon is conquered. Gezer has been seized. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste and has no seed. Huru is become a widow because of Egypt. Read those lines again. Canaan is mentioned as a general region. Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam are mentioned as specific cities, places that can be located on a map, urban centers with walls and buildings and populations. And then, suddenly, Israel. But here is what makes this passage extraordinary, what separates it from a simple list of conquests, what has generated scholarly debate for over a century. Egyptian hieroglyphics use a sophisticated system of determinatives, symbols added to words to indicate what category of thing is being named. When scribes wrote the names of cities, they added a specific symbol indicating a settled urban location. When they wrote the names of foreign lands or territories, they added a different symbol indicating geographic regions. When they wrote the names of peoples, ethnic groups, or tribal populations, they added yet another symbol. Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam all carry the city determinative. They are being described as urban centers, places with fixed locations and permanent structures. But Israel carries a different determinative entirely. Israel is marked with the symbol for a people, not a city, not a kingdom, not a geographic territory with defined borders, a people, a population group, a tribal society. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what Merneptah's scribes were actually describing. They were not claiming to have conquered an Israelite city because there was no Israelite city to conquer. They were not claiming to have seized Israelite territory because Israel did not yet control defined territory in the way that established kingdoms did. They were claiming to have defeated a people, a population living in the land of Canaan that was known by the name Israel. and they were claiming that this people had been devastated so completely that they had no seed, no future, no continuation. That claim, of course, turned out to be spectacularly wrong. But the attempt to make it preserved forever, the evidence that Israel existed. Why this changes everything. Before the discovery of the Merneptah Stele, historians faced a significant problem regarding the early existence of Israel. The Hebrew Bible describes Israel as a people who escaped from Egypt, wandered in the wilderness, and eventually settled in the land of Canaan during the period of the Judges, before the establishment of the monarchy under Saul and David. But for many years, critics argued that there was no solid archaeological evidence confirming that Israel existed as early as the Bible claims. Some scholars suggested that Israel emerged much later, perhaps as late as the 9th or 8th century BCE, and that the earlier biblical narratives were later inventions designed to give the Israelite people a more ancient and impressive origin story. This was not a fringe position. It was a serious scholarly argument supported by respected academics at major universities. The absence of extra-biblical evidence for early Israel was cited repeatedly as proof that the biblical narrative could not be trusted as historical documentation. The Merneptah Stele demolished that argument in a single stroke. Here was evidence from 1208 BCE, from a non-Israelite source, from a hostile witness with no reason to fabricate or exaggerate Israel's existence, confirming that a people called Israel were living in Canaan during the late 13th century, before the Common Era. This was not a minor adjustment to scholarly timelines. This pushed the confirmed existence of Israel back by several centuries compared to what skeptics had been willing to accept. And the source of confirmation was beyond reproach. Merneptah was not trying to help future defenders of biblical historicity. He was trying to celebrate his own victories. He mentioned Israel because Israel was there, because they were significant enough to include among his list of conquered peoples, because they were real and could not be ignored. The Stele also tells us something important about what kind of society Israel was at this early stage. The use of the people determinative rather than the city or land. Determinative suggests that Israel had not yet established the urban centers and territorial boundaries that would characterize the later kingdom period. This fits perfectly with the biblical description of the period of the Judges.
According to biblical chronology, the date 1210 BC falls in the Judges period, where we find in the book of Judges, in those days, Israel had no king.
When Israel was organized as a tribal confederation rather than a centralized state, when they lived among other peoples in Canaan rather than controlling the land exclusively, when charismatic leaders called judges arose periodically to unite the tribes against external threats, but no permanent government structure existed. The Merneptah Stele does not prove every detail of the biblical narrative. It does not mention Moses or Abraham or the Exodus. It does not describe the conquest of Canaan or the giving of the law at Sinai. What it does is confirm the most basic historical claim that underlies everything else. Israel existed as a recognizable people in the land of Canaan during the Late Bronze Age, exactly when and where the Bible says they were. That foundation matters enormously for evaluating the rest of the biblical account. The religious implications. Now we arrive at the aspect of this discovery that generates the most controversy, the implications that extend beyond academic historiography into the realm of religious claims and modern political disputes. Different religious traditions make different claims about the history of the land of Israel and the peoples who have lived there. These claims matter because they are used to justify present-day positions about who has legitimate connection to the land and whose historical narrative should be accepted as authoritative. The Merneptah Stele enters this debate as an uncomfortable piece of evidence for anyone who wishes to minimize or deny the early Israelite presence in Canaan. Islam emerged in the 7th century of the Common Era, approximately 1800 years after the Merneptah Stele was carved. Islamic tradition includes many figures and narratives that overlap with the Hebrew Bible, including Abraham, Moses, and other prophets. However, Islamic interpretation often differs from Jewish and Christian interpretation regarding details of these narratives, including the historical relationship between the Israelites and the land of Canaan. Some Islamic traditions suggest that the biblical narrative has been corrupted or altered over time, that the Israelite claim to the land was not as early or as significant as Jewish tradition maintains, that the historical presence described in the Hebrew Bible has been exaggerated or invented by later editors with religious and political motivations. The Merneptah Stele creates a significant problem for such arguments. This is evidence from over 600 years before Islam existed, created by a source that had no connection to any of the Abrahamic religions, preserved in stone that cannot be edited or rewritten or corrupted by later scribes. It confirms that Israel was a known, named, recognized people living in Canaan during the late 13th century BCE. Any historical narrative that denies or minimizes Israel's early presence in the land must now explain why an Egyptian pharaoh knew Israel by name more than 2,000 years before the modern era. The accidental witness. What makes the Merneptah Stele so powerful as historical evidence is precisely what makes it so uncomfortable for those who might wish it did not exist. Merneptah had absolutely no reason to invent Israel. He had no motivation to confirm anything that would later support biblical claims. He was a pagan king who worshipped Egyptian gods and had never heard of the religious traditions that would eventually emerge from the Israelite people. If anything, including Israel in his list of conquests created a problem for his propaganda. The more formidable your enemies appear, the more impressive your victory becomes. But it also acknowledges that those enemies existed, that they were significant enough to require military action, that they posed a real challenge that needed to be addressed. Merneptah was essentially admitting that Israel mattered, and by trying to claim that he had destroyed them completely, that they were laid waste and had no seed, he inadvertently preserved their name for eternity. This is the great irony that runs through so much of ancient history. The enemies of peoples often become their strongest witnesses. The Assyrians confirmed the existence of the Kingdom of Israel by recording their conquest of it. The Babylonians confirmed the existence of Judah by documenting their destruction of Jerusalem. The Romans confirmed the existence of the Jewish people by celebrating their suppression of the Jewish revolt. And Merneptah confirmed the existence of Israel centuries before any of these later empires by boasting about a victory that clearly did not achieve what he claimed. The Egyptians did not destroy Israel. The people survived. They eventually established a kingdom. They produced a religious tradition that spread across the world. They maintained their identity through thousands of years of exile and persecution. And they did all of this while the stone that declared them finished sat buried in the Egyptian sand, waiting to be discovered and to testify on their behalf. What the stone proves and does not prove. Let me be very clear about what the Merneptah Stele does and does not prove, because precision matters when discussing evidence this significant. The stele does not prove the Exodus narrative. It does not mention Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. It does not describe plagues or the parting of the sea or 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. The stele does not prove the conquest narrative. It does not describe Joshua or the walls of Jericho or the division of the land among the tribes. It does not mention any of the specific military campaigns described in the book of Joshua. The stele does not prove the existence of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. It does not confirm the patriarchal narratives or the stories of Genesis. It does not mention any of the figures from early biblical history. What the stele does prove, definitively and from a hostile source, is something simpler but enormously important. Israel existed as a recognizable people group in the land of Canaan by the late 13th century BCE. That single fact has massive implications. It confirms that the biblical timeline regarding when Israel emerged as a people is broadly accurate. It confirms that Israel was living in Canaan during the period when the Bible says they were settling the land. It confirms that Israel was distinct enough and significant enough to be mentioned alongside major Canaanite cities as targets of Egyptian military action. It confirms that the name Israel was already in use as a designation for this people group, and it suggests, through the people determinative, that Israel was organized as a tribal society rather than an urbanized kingdom, exactly as the Bible describes for the period of the Judges. This is not a small thing. This is foundational confirmation of the basic historical framework within which all the other biblical narratives are set. Even if we cannot independently verify every specific story, we can verify that the people who are the subject of those stories were real, were present where the stories say they were present, and existed when the stories say they existed. The modern debate. The Merneptah Stele continues to generate debate not because its text is unclear or its authenticity is disputed, but because its implications are uncomfortable for certain narratives that have developed in the modern era. Archaeological evidence rarely exists in isolation. It enters a world already filled with competing claims, established narratives, and deeply held beliefs about what the past means and who has the right to interpret it. There are those who argue that the ancient Israelites have no meaningful connection to the modern Jewish people, that 3,000 years of history have so thoroughly transformed both the land and its populations that ancient texts have no bearing on modern claims. The Merneptah Stele complicates this argument by demonstrating that the identity called Israel has been continuous and recognized for over 3 millennia. There are those who argue that the biblical narrative is entirely mythological, that Israel, as described in Scripture, never existed in any historically meaningful sense, that the stories are folklore rather than history and should be treated as such. The Stele provides concrete evidence that at least the basic framework of the biblical account corresponds to historical reality that can be verified from independent sources. There are those who argue that the land of Canaan belonged to other peoples first, and that the Israelite presence was always illegitimate, always colonial, always an intrusion into someone else's homeland. The Stele cannot resolve questions of moral legitimacy, but it does establish that Israel was present in Canaan during the same period as other Bronze Age peoples, not as a late arrival, but as an early participant in the complex ethnic tapestry of the ancient Near East. The Merneptah Stele speaks to all of these arguments, not by resolving them definitively, but by establishing baseline facts that any serious argument must accommodate. Israel existed. Israel was in Canaan. Israel was there more than 3,000 years ago. Israel was recognized by one of the great powers of the ancient world as a distinct people with a distinct identity worth mentioning in royal records. Whatever conclusions one draws about modern politics or contemporary religious claims, those conclusions must account for the evidence that the Stele provides. The stone does not argue. It does not advocate. It does not take sides in debates that would not exist for millennia after it was carved. It simply exists, saying what it has always said, unchanged by the centuries, indifferent to the controversies that swirl around its message, waiting for honest observers to acknowledge what it plainly states. 3,200 years ago, a pharaoh carved his triumph into stone, certain it would proclaim his power for eternity. He could not have imagined that among his boasts lay a truth he never intended to record, a name that would outlast dynasties, gods, and empires. The Merneptah Stele stands today as a silent witness to history's surprises, proving that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes from those who sought to erase it. What other secrets are hidden in the relics of the ancient world, waiting to challenge everything we think we know about civilizations, faith, and identity? The story is far from over, and every artifact still has a voice to speak.